Republicans dead. Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
No, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Folks, I am absolutely delighted to be joined today by Russ Buettner and Susanne Craig. They are Pulitzer Prize-winning authors of a fantastic new book called Lucky Loser: How Donald Trump Squandered His Father's Fortune and Created the Illusion of Success. This is something I tell you folks a lot. This is a good book. This is a good book. This will open your eyes to a lot of the Potemkin village that has always been the Trump enterprise. So thank you guys for coming on today. I want to start out with the premise that you guys address, I think, very clearly. Donald Trump's mastery has been in the illusion of wealth, has been in the public image of wealth more than being an effective businessman or a developer or anything else. As he goes through and you catalog all these eras of the Trump empire, from real estate to casinos to the art of the deal to the Apprentice to politics, but talk to us about how that illusion was crafted from the very beginning, starting with back as far back as Fred Trump.
That's an interesting question. That does capture sort of the arc of our big story here. And at some points during that, it feels like Donald Trump had sort of a plan to create that illusion. And in other parts, it feels like he just needed to be that person. And so he was just going to say it over and over because it was just so central to his identity. Fred Trump actually always kind of hid the fact that he was wealthy. He built a house for his family, a nice house, but not an ostentatious house, in a nice neighborhood in Queens in the 1950s. And then he and his wife lived the rest of their lives there. They didn't take fancy vacations. They drove a Rolls Royce, and he bought his wife minks every once in a while. But that was about the extent of their pretentiousness or their showiness of wealth. Donald Trump, on the other hand, right away started trying to acquire sort of all the signposts that I'm a rich person. But he really began in the 1970s with that, talking about building a bunch of things and acquiring property that he hadn't built and he wasn't acquiring, to the point that by the late 70s, when he proposed that he was going to build a big project down in the ferry terminal in Manhattan with residentials and all this, the New York Daily News said he's a major New York developer and should be taken seriously on this proposal. But at that point, he hadn't developed anything at all. It was all just a magic act. And then he really benefited as he's promoting himself from sort of what we and others have called wealth porn in the 1980s, the rise where things sort of changed. Before, it was sort of Fred Trump's world. It was considered not cool to look like you were really wealthy or to brag about your wealth. Suddenly that became a good thing to do. It became acceptable and people became interested in that, and lifestyles of the rich and famous started, and it was sort of a press your nose up against the glass of rich people. Donald Trump really wanted to live in that fishbowl. So he had bought Mar-a-Lago for not very much money with loans. And they featured that place. He had a helicopter. They featured his helicopter. They showed the lights outside of the casinos he had built with unsupportable levels of debt. And it made him look really rich. And then he lobbied to get his name on the new Forbes 400 list. He worked really hard at that. He used a pseudonym. He said he had taken over his father's business. He hadn't. And that trend just escalated throughout his life.
Right. So, Russ, that's a good point. And Susanne, you've actually profiled a lot of the story underneath Trump's inheriting $413 million from Fred through this complex series of tax dodges so that he could avoid, tax liabilities in taking over Fred's enterprise, taking over Fred's world. Talk to us a little bit about how that tax mechanism that they built, I won't call it a fraud outright, maybe it was, but how that tax fraud has essentially been a generational play now in Trump's world.
Right. You see that he inherited a huge amount of money. We estimated it back in 2018 at roughly $400 and some million. And that was enhanced by tax fraud. And you see Fred Trump throughout his life taking advantage of loopholes in the system. And he hated taxes. And that's a through line through the book. And then what you see, there's I kind of think of it, there's two main ones. One of them is the way that they valued assets. And when they would go to the tax man, they would value things low. And I think they would really push the envelope on that. And that's an interesting through line in the book. And then we see some other interesting shenanigans, I would say. One of them that sort of really sticks in our mind and we really explore it in the book is Donald Trump in the early 1990s. He's on the ropes financially. He's going through the casino, the casino bankruptcy. He's in trouble. And Fred Trump is getting old. He's heading, just actuarially, he's going to die at some point. And you think of the Trump name, you think of debt. Donald Trump loved to take on debt, but Fred Trump was the opposite. And Fred had, towards the end of his life, accumulated a huge amount of cash. That cash was largely stuck in the various companies that he had that ran the buildings that he owned in the outer boroughs. And it was looking like if he passed away, the children would be facing a huge estate tax at the time on all of that cash. So it was sort of top of mind for the kids. And they created a shell company called All County. And what happened was Fred Trump, for years, he needed stuff for his buildings, paint, boilers, you name it. He would go and he would buy it from wholesalers. And then he would get it and use it just like imagine any other building owner. And all of a sudden, one day, the switch flipped. And All County, a company that was controlled by Donald Trump and his siblings and a cousin of theirs, started buying all the supplies for Fred Trump's buildings. And they would sell it to Fred Trump's buildings at a markup. So if the boiler costs $4,000, all of a sudden it's $5,000, and they would pocket the difference. And they did this systematically, building by building. And the idea was to draw down the cash that Fred was sitting on, and that company had no other purpose, and it netted them millions of dollars. And we concluded in 2018, and we did a big story on it at the time, that it was tantamount to tax fraud. So that's the sort of stuff you see early on that was going on with both Fred and Donald. And Fred knew about that mechanism, that company that they were running.
Sure. So, that illusion, I mean, even at the end of his life, Fred was bailing Donald out from his bad casino deals with shady, these people have never seemed to be quite on the right side of the line with the law. But Fred was bailing Donald out. It wasn't that Donald had built anything. He inherited this giant sum of money and squandered a lot of it in things that did not work out, that were not money makers, that, aside from a few later investments like 40 Wall Street, it seems like a lot of his properties and a lot of his plans, the casinos in particular, were just way overpriced and way overvalued because of his strategic desire to bump his net worth up. What is there a consistent through line about the overvaluing of his properties? And the reason I asked that is I want to get to the fact that he's finally, after 50 years, has been held to account for that in court.
I mean, the issue where that became a legal issue for him was overvaluing them to banks, I think, to try to get bigger loans than what he was entitled to.
Right.
I would say that he generally had, that's a hard thing to say whether that was a trend, because we don't have a great window into every loan he ever applied for.
Sure.
I think one through line that you're describing is that he regularly spent more on projects than what made sense. His father, by contrast, always worked out to the penny how much money he was going to collect in rent, and how much he was going to spend on construction. And he never, to the best of our knowledge, had an unprofitable project in a very long career. Donald Trump, on the other hand, very early started believing, and there's a real switch that flips in about 1985, that any project with his name is going to bring in enough money to cover whatever he spends. So the casinos are just a great emblem of that. He spent $1 billion. He was on the Taj Mahal casino there. It was instantly, analysts said, this is never going to make money. He got that analyst fired, took great steps, and the analyst was proven right within 6 months. And that just continued. And that continued into his later life as well. When he built the Chicago Tower, one of the things we've uncovered recently is that he had said it was a great success, this massive hotel, retail, residential complex on the Chicago River. But really, it was failing from the moment it opened, and he secretly declared it worthless on his tax returns. Right, and that was the last big project of his career, and it was a colossal
I've frozen
failure.
up.
The renovation of the old post office into a hotel in D.C. was a failure. He had to pump $7 to $10 million a year, we see on his tax returns, into that to keep it open until he sold it. So that kind of overspending was definitely a through line. And then, yes, when he would pay property taxes, he would try to undervalue those things. And when he would get loans, we especially saw that in the Attorney General's case, he would regularly overvalue them in order to keep his favorable loan rates.
Right.
So Donald Trump has gone through almost every major commercial lending facility in the world. How is it that the greater fool theory keeps applying to a guy who obviously does not, I mean, he's constantly restructuring his loans. He's constantly walking away from obligations. How is it that people keep lending this guy money over all this period of time? I mean, after he was president, that's a different story. Obviously, that changes the ball game. But I'm curious, like, how he went through all of these banks, Manny Hanny, all these banks in the 80s and 90s, and they just kept getting burned, Deutsche, and they kept coming back. What was it? Just the paper flow? Was it his ability to bullshit them? It's always fascinated me. Like, these are not stupid people.
No, but I think there is just, it's interesting because he does sort of go down a food chain where at a certain point, the bigger banks won't deal with him. But then he meets a bank like Deutsche Bank. And you look at the time that he met Deutsche Bank, they were expanding in America. They were hungry for new business. And so they took him on. And he keeps kind of finding banks like that are going to take him on. And then as we go on, he sees that he's lending to I think, financial institutions you maybe haven't heard of, like Ladder Capital, where he has a connection there. You know, someone in his company has a relative that works there. But I have to say, I covered Wall Street forever, and could never. At a certain point, I stopped just being amazed at who banks would give money to. So I want to say that he took advantage of that, right? I mean, I remember I covered a story once, and some guy he leveraged his stock 10 times to 10 banks across Wall Street, and none of the other banks bothered to check with each other that the stock was already leveraged. Like, I've seen this movie so many times. Right. And Donald Trump's just, one iteration of it. But Deutsche Bank is one that's very well known that is loaned to him. And they, that was at a moment where, they were expanding in the US. They took him on. And I have to say, for the most part, they got burned by him in Chicago. He ended up suing them. But for the most part, his loans were performing. But it was incredible to see, even after they sued him, Deutsche Bank came back and another division of the bank was lending to him, because they were so like messed up there. They weren't talking to each other, and they didn't know what the other arm was doing and didn't bother to check because they just wanted the business. So that was sort of crazy, and that's the sort of thing he was able to take advantage of.
I had in dealing with Trump. In the political realm, was I started to do focus groups back in 15 and 16, all over the country, 32 focus groups in 16 cities. We went out and we really were asking the questions. And over again, people had this public image of Trump that was absolutely impermeable. And it was like, nope, he's the richest man in America. Nope, he built Manhattan. Nope, he is the best manager in the world. He's all these, that illusion. To my determination, and the first few focus groups, we were staring at each other like, what is going on here? What is happening in this country? Why do they believe this? And I realized it's because none of us in my professional political cohort, none of us watch television. We watch news. We don't watch television for the most part. Then we started asking, do you watch The Apprentice? And that was 15 years of beaming into the brains of a lot of American voters and a lot of Americans this idea that Donald Trump was the character he was playing on The Apprentice. Talk to us a little bit about your observations on why that illusion because this is a guy who is failing up. He's essentially doing the easiest job in the world. But when they were making that show, they were absolutely mortified by the fact that this was not a smart guy. This was not a guy who was together on the character he was playing was, and that they were editing into it, was very different from the real Trump.
Geez, I wish we would have talked to you before we wrote this book, Rick. That's some fascinating experience there, and it matches ours, like anecdotally. I think New Yorkers in general reacted to him the same way that you did, where they thought this is a guy who's been a sideshow in our public discourse for decades.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't take him seriously. Certainly nobody in real estate in New York took him seriously as anything other than sort of a promoter. He's very effective at obviously bringing attention to whatever project he's involved in. But at that time when Mark Burnett decided to make Donald Trump the star of his next show, Donald Trump's life was, again, not going well. His casinos were on the verge of bankruptcy. He needed $50 million to be able to hang on to anything. Doesn't seem like he had it. He was pushing his siblings to sell their father's empire off, which would bring him almost a couple $100 million. So that was not a point. And the Chicago thing was stalled. There was not a point when things were going great. And they walked in there that day. And, we have scenes in the book, you've probably seen them, where like they're expecting to see this hubbub of a worldwide business with smart people and things happening. And the place stinks like moldy carpet. The furniture's all chipped. Furniture all dates back to the 1980s when he opened the building. His desk is just news clippings of himself, no computer, no blueprints, none of that. And they have to reinvent him. And we've always thought of this. They made this video, this 3-minute bit that they called Meet the Billionaire, where they made him look like the king of New York, and like he built the whole place. And it had this narration of him, like with this like hard scrabble story. I did all of this. I had some hard times, but I'm back. I'm bigger than ever. And we have always thought of that as the greatest political ad that's ever been made, unwittingly, right? It was not reality. They called it reality television, but it was not reality. Burnett called it dramality because drama was the key component of it. But yet it resonated, right? And you capture that years later where it's stuck in people's mind. And that week after week after week, how could you think if you watched that show, he was anything but what you were told he was on reality television?
And Rick, I have to tell you that when things fell apart between Donald Trump and NBC, and Donald Trump told NBC that he was going to be running for president, they knew that he would do well because they had polling on him and data on him that would make political pollsters look like amateur hour. They've got minute by minute.
I've
and
heard
they knew
that story before.
And we talked to Paul Telegi, the executive at NBC who dealt with him, and he had the numbers in front of him, and he said, I knew how this was going to end.
Yeah, and again, it told me that I had a blind spot in, and I'm a guy who literally makes television ads for a living, but I don't really watch television, and it was really something that struck me later, like how could I have missed this coming? Because it really was 15 years of beating into the brains. It was a very well-rated show for a long time. It had a lot of attention and focus, and especially with people who ended up mapping over the likely voter pool. Those likely voters, they watch The Apprentice, a lot of them. And
you repeat a lie often enough, and it becomes a truth of some sort. People believe it, right?
But that's something, and you see Trump's reaction when like the expose you guys did on the taxes. You see Trump's reaction to something like that, where it's so furious because a lot of the time the Trump mojo, the Trump illusion, has been reported uncritically. It has been reported without context or without even a very hard fact check behind it. And when I worked in New York for Giuliani, when he was still a sane person, I thought Trump was, I'm like, oh, he must be a billionaire. And Rudy was like, no, we take care of the guy. We give him a couple parking spaces every year, but he's kind of an idiot. But the way he got covered over and over and over again, what is the blind spot in the press that has allowed this to happen? Because it still happens right now. I mean, it still happens even in our politics. I mean, the financial press has done a indifferent job on Trump, you guys being one of the notable exceptions, but that idea he just gets a free pass over and over again is not wrong.
And it's something that has that we felt obviously troubled by because we're involved in that.
Sure.
That's the work of our life, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you can see, first of all, the difficulty is that unlike almost everybody else that gets described as rich, there's no public reporting on him. He doesn't work for an investment firm that files anything with the SEC. He doesn't work for a public corporation where they have a reality check every 3 months. It's all buried in these little files that some guy named Alan Weisselberg, who nobody heard of, was literally the only person who knew what was really making money. We've talked to people who worked in that office, and they had no idea which properties were losing and if any of them were performing at all. They kept that to themselves. So really, reporters had no real recourse to figure things out.
Sure.
Also, he's covered for all those years because he's sort of a humorous sideshow to the New York papers, right? And it's not, they don't think that they're covering a guy who's running for mayor and they have to figure out if there's a disconnect here, until he announced his candidacy and said, I'm a successful businessman. I'm going to do the same thing for the United States I've done for my companies, which kind of turned out to be true. Nobody really had reason to check it all that closely. It was all fast moving stories. And he bore the signposts of wealth. And it's hard to say, his name's on this building. Does that mean he owns it or doesn't own it? It seems like he's got a lot of money. I tell you, I've spoken to editors over the years who really thought Trump was super, super rich and all on his own. So it's really hard to shake that when there's no way to do it and it's fast moving. And newspapers and news organizations have to pick their battle. Is it worth trying to check Donald Trump's wealth when all he's doing is talking about his divorce from his latest wife,
Right, or his plane or what have you. So the Trump brand has taken it's taken, I think, a pretty profound hit in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But he is trying to have some sort of generational thing. My argument has been that the political business, the direct email fundraising business, has been Trump's most successful enterprise of his whole career. Do you see them continuing in? I mean, I don't know that Don Jr. and Eric and Ivanka have the same kind of through line for their future. But it strikes me that this is no longer a brand even that's going to appeal to, the greater fool. It strikes me it's become kind of a poisonous brand nationally. Do you guys, what do you see the contours of the economic future of the Trump organization looking like?
It's interesting that you mentioned that about the political brand. And it used to be a hospitality brand, and it was known because Donald Trump would spend so much money on his property as a luxury brand. And I talked to some brand experts in the reporting of the book who said they no longer even follow it as a hospitality brand. They consider it purely a political brand. So I think that that's one thing, and I want to come back to that. But the other thing, just to think about the Trump organization and to put it a little bit in context, their last construction projects was the Chicago Tower that was completed around 2008. They did the renovation of the old post office, but this is no longer any sort of organization that is building, new construction. Right now, you see they've got a collection of golf courses, some hotels, and I think they're a little bit of a brand now that's looking at what they can sell. They sold the old post office lease. That hotel was costing them a lot just to keep going. It cost a lot to renovate it. And they were losing money on it. So they got rid of that. There's a golf course they've sold in the New York area. Donald Trump's selling discreetly, and he's got things up for sale, like condo units that he owns. So you're seeing the organization itself shrinking, and then it's got a number of headwinds coming at it. I think notably, if we think about that fine from the New York Attorney General that he might have to pay, and that's upwards of $400 million. If he doesn't win and that's upheld on appeal, that's going to be a body blow to the Trump organization. So when you think about generational,
they don't have that kind of cash anymore, right? I mean,
we're not sure. We don't have a current, and I think it's important. When people think about how much cash he has on hand, just think about how much cash you have on hand. It changes from day to day. You may owe your brother some money, or you're spending it on a vacation, and it goes up and down. In his case, he may be plugging a hole at a money losing golf course that needs renovations. We don't know kind of day to day how much he has or what that means if he has to meet that penalty. But it's not going to be easy for him. I think we can safely say that from what we've seen. So
Right.
I think the Trump organization going forward right now, Eric is running it kind of day to day, but they've got a lot of professional managers in there that run the golf courses and are able to do that for them.
Right. Right. So the tech company, Truth Social, that is going the way of most meme stocks. It looks like it's headed down towards penny stock territory in a pretty quick order. There was a moment, I think, that they really thought he was going to make billions out of this thing and cash out at some very high multiple. But that seems to be like I don't know that he could ever make that play again, given the place he is on his calendar of his life and his political fortunes. But that really hasn't worked out as a major deal either, has it?
No, it's been a very stagnant business that hasn't really grown at all, and their business plan is perplexing. It has the revenue of about equivalent to a McDonald's franchise, like one McDonald's franchise, but yet it's still valued today at like almost $1.5 billion. If he starts to sell, it's going to go out. It's hard to imagine it's going to survive a couple of days if he sells big amounts of stock. But I think you raised the question about his election, and even there's a chat group on Truth Social for investors in the stock, and even they all believe that the only chance for that stock to go up is if he comes in, fires the SEC director, they prosecute the people who they believe are illegally short selling the stock, and then everything will be great and it'll go back up to what they paid, $16, $70 a share for it.
Good luck.
Like that's right. But that's kind of where he is. And I think like you look at what we noticed looking at his tax returns is that the money he was making from big licensing deals like Philips Van Heusen, Serta mattresses, mass commercial brands was really helping him subsidize businesses that weren't going so well. All that money went away. And you look at what's coming in its place, the new licensing deals are like, there's a group of them that are funded by Saudi Arabia. You have to wonder if they're going to care about him if he's not president, right? And that could change that. And then these really creepy crypto deals and even Truth Social is a bit manipulative.
And the sneakers and the Bibles.
The sneakers, Bibles, coins, NFTs, Melania's Christmas ornaments. I mean, at some point it becomes like the QVC network on television back in the 90s. And it just feels, I mean, it feels gross. A lot of it feels very sleazy now and it's like last minute cash grab. But then again, you know, as he likes to say, Mar-a-Lago is worth $1 billion. If it is, I'd love to see him pay property taxes on it at $1 billion. I think you guys have really captured something here. Let me ask you guys one more question before we wrap up. We're getting up on our time. What is something that people will learn in this book that will shock them more? What's the number one thing take away from this book that people will go, wow, I did not know that about Donald Trump?
We probably both have different views of that, maybe. I mean, to me, it was the big shift that he made in 1985. He just I'd never really picked up on that. But when you lay it out as the arc of his career, you really see that he got those first few projects with partners and his father's help and more experienced partners. And then he decided he could do anything. And so he announces this insane project on the Upper West Side of 70 acres. He's going to build the tallest building in the world and a bunch of skyscrapers around it. And it winds up costing him tens of millions of dollars just to keep that property from going back to the bank for years. And ultimately has to give it up. He also decides that he knows how to run a football team. And I think that's one of the most enlightening areas of it, right? Because it's like 1986, he buys a USFL team, this new upstart league. He really convinces all the other owners that they can move to the fall. The networks will come their way. He will produce the networks, he tells them, and then they will sue the NFL for antitrust. And this is all going to work out great. And it completely crashes the network into the ground because they let him take control of it. And I feel like that's really where he became the Donald Trump, as still a pretty young man, that we all saw in the White House for all these years. I don't know. What about you, Sue?
I don't know. The part I really loved reporting and fleshing out was the just the myth making that happened and how just over and over and over, like he just went from at a young age appropriating his father's wealth. It's written in the New York Times. He's worth $200 million. He was probably worth $2. And that just kept growing. And we talked to all these producers of these shows, like, how did this happen? And they just saw his name everywhere. And so they declared him a billionaire, even on 60 Minutes. And we went back even and talked to Wall Street Journal reporters when Donald Trump went through his corporate raider phase. And, he would call them and say, oh, yeah, I sold all my stock before the crash. He's on the record. He takes advantage of their better instincts. They're not going to ask for his he's not going to give them his stock statements, and reporters aren't asking for that on deadline. So it gets put in the paper, and this myth gets created. But the level that we went to sort of understand that, I thought, was a really fun part of the reporting of the book, and I think will be really illuminating for people.
Fantastic. Well, folks, the book is Lucky Loser. It's on my iPad right now. Didn't get a hardback yet. How Donald Trump squandered his father's fortune and created the illusion of success. And folks, that illusion of success is what undergirds his entire political illusion as well. So I want to thank you guys so much for coming on. Russ Buettner and Susanne Craig, two of the greatest financial reporters in this country. Read this book. It is absolutely top-notch. And I want to thank you guys again for coming on the show, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks very much, Rick.
Thanks, Rick. That was great.